McCuistion, for over 28 years talking about things that matter with people who care. Production of McCuistion is made possible in part by individual viewers, supporters of the Foundation for Responsible Television, the University of Texas at Dallas, creating the future.
Well, welcome to the McCuistion program, and I am so happy to have as my co-host today Jim Falk. Jim is the CEO and President of the World Affairs Council of
Always
Dallas,
good to be with you.
Thank you very much, and you're going to tell us what this exciting program is going to be about. So
I sure am. So since 9/11, our nation's focus has been devoted to protecting our homeland from foreign threats. However, homegrown domestic terrorism is on the rise from a variety of hate groups that direct their violence against whites, blacks, Jews, and others as well. We know the government cannot do this alone. It will take a combination of government, business, and yes, really all of us as individuals. Joining us today are two good friends. First, it's nice to see you again, Buck Revell. Buck retired from the FBI in 1994 with the rank of Associate Deputy Director, and he's had considerable experience in counterterrorism, combating extremism in and outside of government. And then Rick Halperin. He's been a member of the SMU faculty since 1985, where he began teaching human rights in 1990. He was chosen as the founding director of the Embry Human Rights Program in 2006 and is a recognized global advocate for a variety of human rights issues, including hate crimes and discrimination. We're also going to be hearing from Farah Pandith. She's a senior fellow at Harvard's JFK School of Government, as well as an adjunct fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations, and she's the author of a new book, How We Win, which examines violent extremism and proposes strategies to defeat it. So let's hear what Farah has to say first, because it'll really set the context for the rest of our discussion.
We have to look at the threat we're facing today in the context of a pre and a post 9/11 for a lot of different reasons, not just because of the technology that has advanced in the last 20 years, allowing ideas to ricochet around the world and to be absorbed in a millisecond. But we also have to think about what it means, what identity means in today's world. And for young Muslims, post 9/11, one of the most shocking things that I found in traveling to dozens of countries around the world, talking to Muslims under the age of 30, was that no matter where they were, whether Muslims in a Muslim majority country or a Muslim living as a minority, that they were experiencing the very same thing. They were asking themselves questions about what it meant to be a Muslim. What's the difference between culture and religion? And this fierce attention post 9/11, where they've seen the word Islam or Muslim on the front pages of papers online and offline every single day since 9/11, has had a very profound effect on how they think about themselves. And it's not, it's important to remember, every young person growing up asks questions around their identity. This is not unique.
But let me be a devil's advocate
Yes.
for a minute, because when you look at the number of terrorist acts that have taken place in the United States and around the world, most of them have been committed by Muslims.
Terrorist activities based on groups like Al-Qaeda and Shabab and the Taliban and now ISIS have revolutionized what it means, what terrorism means in the world today. We've seen in the modern usage of terrorism, what we've seen in modern times has been everything from the IRA to the FARC to other terrorist organizations. But there's something, you're correct, there is something very different about what has taken place with groups like Al-Qaeda or the so-called Islamic State that have used the name of Islam to build their armies, to think about a global struggle for identity and belonging around a very, corrupted version of religion. It has had it's made a difference in the world. Their ability to change the way we have thought about who we are as humans on the planet, how we have thought about defense, how we've thought about the impact of on our cities and on our nations has absolutely changed. But one of the things that's extremely important as we think about this threat is not to sit in the situation in 2019 going, which is the biggest threat we need to face? Are we more willing to think about being killed by this group or that group? The fact of the matter is, there are almost 1 billion Muslims under the age of 30 around the world. And that's the demographic that groups like the so-called Islamic State are focused on to build their armies. And that statistic alone should be shocking to most people, because we know that Muslims live all over the world. It's not just in a particular region. And if young people are growing up being lured in and being focused on by terrorist organizations that are trying to make them think that the only way to be a real Muslim is to join their armies, you don't need tens of thousands. You don't need 1 billion Muslims under 30. You need 1 or 2 to do something on the streets in Boston.
So, Rick, you've heard what Farah has to say. What do you think about this idea that she expresses about the need to find identity?
Well, I think everybody wants to be able to identify with their group, whichever the group is, religious, racial, ethnic, what have you. But I would take a little different view as to what is needed. I think part of this need for people is what is the void that makes them lured towards ideologies that propose and espouse violence and destruction. To me, as a human rights educator, what is clearly missing and harps on everybody's identity is the idea of universal human rights and human rights education, which stresses all of the human rights inherent in everybody, regardless of who we are. So the commonality for all of us is the fact that we are alive. And the secondary differences, Muslim, Christian, Sikh, Hindu, African American, Buddhist, these are characteristics which divide us. I would like to see an educational system in the world, and certainly in the United States, which harps on from the youngest age possible, from kindergarten through university, the commonality of respect for dignity, diversity, inclusion, difference. If we had this from grade kindergarten up, I don't think you would have a generation of young people in this country or around the world that see difference as a negative thing. We would see it as the commonality between us.
Yeah, well, Buck, one of the things that I know you end up spending a lot of time is the Muslim area. There are some people who believe that every Muslim is a terrorist. And so would you try to persuade them that that's not the case, please?
Well, it's obviously nonsense. I can't put a percentage on the number of Muslims that have taken to violence. It's too many, but it's certainly not anywhere close to a majority. The difficulty is that they operate in an area of our society that we protect very assiduously, this freedom of speech, freedom of religion, the freedom of assembly. And within that, there is a substantial area where they can not only advocate things that are positive, but things that are negative. And where that occurs, then it tends to fester and grow. And we as a society have a difficult time in dealing with those issues before they reach the point of violence.
And what do you, I mean, for the FBI and other law enforcement, obviously you're not in the FBI anymore, but they are dealing with this issue all the time and trying to ferret out the folks who are, let's just say, more on the religious side versus the folks who looking at it politically and something that they would like to wreak violence about.
And I might add there, I mean, it's a question we always hear about winning the hearts and minds. Right. So are your efforts, or FBI's efforts, winning the hearts and minds, or is it protecting the U.S. security?
Unfortunately, the FBI can't reach everybody. Everybody doesn't, watch a particular television program. There are programs in every field division in the Bureau that tries to reach out and make those kind of accommodations, and have organizations that do nothing but that. However, there are television programs and there are other teaching aids that have been developed. But the main thing is that the internet and all of the social media give such diverse and broad coverage to society that the Bureau and law enforcement have to be able to find the movement or activity that is moving towards violence, not preaching, one ideology over another, but moving towards violence and be able to intersect it before it reaches that final stage. And that's the most difficult issue.
Would you agree that we are seeing an increase in domestic terrorism?
not an increase. Actually, when I first went in the Bureau, domestic terrorism was the thing. We weren't dealing with, except for the IRA, we weren't dealing with international terrorism much. It was mostly terrorism in the United States. Ku Klux Klan, the Aryan Nations, a number of right-wing organizations, the FALN, which was the left-wing Puerto Rican, but it was primarily focused on internal issues, and it was both right and left. Some of my first cases were against the Klan and the Abraham Lincoln Brigade, going that far back. The growth, particularly since the Munich Olympics bombing, has been towards
in 1972.
In 72 has been towards the Middle Eastern focused organizations, and of course we've heard them today: Al Qaeda, the Islamic State, and so forth. But that has never put down the continued growth and activity of the extreme right, and that has occurred here and does continue, and we haven't seen it be brought to heel as yet.
Yeah, and Rick, let me ask you about from a global standpoint. There are those who would say that we brought a lot of this from a global standpoint of the Muslim on ourselves. What in the heck were we doing in 1991 and in all these places? Of course, obviously after 9/11, we went into Iraq on, let's just say, lack of intelligence. Let's be kind. And so we created all these people who hate us. We ended up helping overthrow the Iranian elected person in 1953, Mossadegh, and Iran. And so if you listen and talk to people there, as I have and as you have, the reason that they're mad about us is because they've got reason to be. How would you address that?
And I would agree. And this is not an aberration. This has been a sad norm in American foreign policy in any region of the world, whether it be Africa, Central or South America, the Middle East. The United States has not displayed a consistent foreign policy ethic, whatever is deemed to be in America's best national interest. So we have supported oppressive regimes from the left and the right. This hasn't been a consistent ideological fervor that we have upheld. And so when people are oppressed by their own countries, it's not hard to see the links when the United States has supported that person coming to power, i.e. Saddam Hussein in '77. It's not hard to see and understand why certain groups of people have generational loathing of the United States for the misery in their own areas of the world.
Well, even 1948, something called Israel.
To be sure.
Where Harry Truman said he's going to recognize it right away, in spite of the fact his Secretary of State and other people said not to do that. So we became, let's just say, persona non grata to a lot of the Muslim world in 1948, didn't we?
And it has not changed. You could make a case that at least since 1979, you could go back earlier, but since the Iranian hostage crisis of 40 years ago in 2 months, the United States has had a difficult entanglement throughout the Middle East in multiple countries. American lives have been lost in multiple countries, from Lebanon, Syria, Afghanistan, Pakistan, take your pick. And there's no end in sight. There is virtually no end in sight. So the idea that this young people who are coming of political age now and who haven't even been born yet will have a different target other than the United States to target in their hatred, I'm sad to say that's going to continue.
I think you both make good points, but we're not the only one that's been stirring the pot. Let's hear what Farah Pandith has to say about Saudi Arabia's involvement.
The tactics that Saudi Arabia has deployed over decades, this is not just a matter of, a couple of years, over decades, and they've spent billions of dollars doing this, has manifested in a lot of different ways. You talked about textbooks that teach a very specific way to be a Muslim. Those textbooks are so severe and so strident in their interpretation of a monolithic way to be, who is and who is not a Muslim, that the so-called Islamic State used those very same textbooks when they were standing up their so-called caliphate.
You know, I think it's so interesting to see how the United States, in a sense, has to keep its close relationship with Saudi Arabia, but indeed they truly have been exporting some of the hate that we hear. And Farah talks about how the Quran, the version that they use and distributed even in our prisons, has had a great impact. Let's listen to what she has to say.
You know, a holy book that is hundreds of years old and is being looked at today, just like the Bible or any other old scripture, there are many people who have translated it, and the words are very complex. How you think about what the origin of the word is and what word you're going to use and how you translate it, it has many, many meanings. You can't just pick up, you know, an old version of the Bible and expect somebody to be able to read it and say, I get the context of it. It requires really serious study. What the Saudis have done is they have scrubbed away nuance. They've scrubbed and they've interpreted it in a very strict way. They've given this version of the Quran for free around the world. It's come to America. It exists in mosques and in prisons around the United States. These versions of the Quran exist in countries all over the world and in schools and in community centers. And the reason why that is important is because when people look to Saudi Arabia, their expectation is that because two holy sites are in Saudi Arabia, they must know more than anyone else.
Buck, you've spent so much of your time in government and outside working in the Middle East and in Saudi Arabia. Why can't we get a handle on this?
They've made a deal with the Wahhabi element of Islam for internal peace in Saudi Arabia that allows the Wahhabis to expand and export this radical version of Islam that she was talking about. Probably 80% of the mosques in the United States use texts and materials that come from the Wahhabi sect of Islam. It is virulent and it is hateful, and it's difficult to get people to overcome what they see and read in school and in their places of worship. And that's the problem is that the key materials that most of the moderate Muslims are trying to overcome are coming in from Saudi Arabia and essentially poisoning the well.
Looking globally as you do, I mean, you travel, tell us some of the travels you've been, but what do you think is the biggest issue globally, and how does that affect that person watching this program?
I think the biggest difference today from my generation, I was born in 1950, is clearly technology. The world has been reduced to the size of a pea. And we all live in real time where you can literally sit in the comfort of your home and see what is unfolding halfway around the world in protest and violence in the name of a certain cause. And sadly, people are inspired by this or adhere to those beliefs and are affected negatively for all of us as an innocent society that bears the brunt of their actions. So clearly to me, the onset of technology, the purveyance of hate on the internet, the lure of hate to young people in this country and around the world. This is a global phenomenon.
Well, what's so bad is that this internet and the World Wide Web were supposed to make it easier to educate people about good things. I think that's the case. But we also have some countries, Rick, and I'm going to use China as an example. Russia is the lesser example, but the internet has been significantly and is significantly censored in China before and now still. And so not only do we have countries who can foment this hate, we've got some who make sure that the truth is not told about what's happening in their own country. How do we deal with that issue? Because, you know, we talk about trade with China, we talk about Hong Kong, we talk about all, but we don't talk about human rights in China.
Well, you're right, but you know, I would say we don't talk about human rights in most countries or in this country. There is no culture of human rights in the United States. If we speak about human rights in this country, we're usually pointing an accusatory finger about some other country. China, North Korea, Saudi Arabia, South Africa, Cuba, take your pick, and they are the usual suspects whose human rights record can easily be criticized with accuracy. We are pretty slow to criticize our friends and their human rights problems, and no country, including the United States, likes to bend the finger at itself. So human rights could be a leverage with countries, but it is rarely used. I think it's a tragedy. If the United States had a greater culture of human rights, if we could get to a point in this country where we could talk about human rights the way we talk about sports, we'd have something. But we are a long way from that.
What is that human rights in this country that we should focus on?
Well, I think it's several. Clearly,
Or what's the most serious issue that faces us right now?
in this country, the lack of historical knowledge about America's own human rights record to ourselves and people in this country, and how we deal with people around the world.
You and I talked about this a few days ago, and you said that we as Americans really don't appreciate the fact that our history has been very violent.
That's right, and I stand by that. We all are raised generically in this country to accept a pretty strong truism. We're all blessed to live in this country, born or raised, or to come to this country, because this is still one of the greater countries in the world to live in regarding personal and individual freedoms. If you don't go out and break the law and advocate or use violence, you can pretty much live a dream and be who it is that you want to be. But we don't do that in this country. We don't expose ourselves to the really sordid past. We all know about slavery and how terrible it was. We know what we did to indigenous people. But most people have no clue about sterilizing people and eugenics and our role as the background to Nazi laws, which were horrific, of course, to say the least, and ongoing violence, the death penalty, which is justified as a criminal justice sanction, but it's a major human rights issue.
How many countries have the death penalty now?
There's 195 countries in the world, and about 58 use it or have it in law as a common practice. Most of the people in this country and around the world do not know that the United States is an aberration in the world with the death penalty. Now, ironically, we're sitting here on a night when Texas is going to use the death penalty later tonight. But it's a major human rights violation. It's not just an act, it's a process that deals with terror, physical and psychological torture and terror. But this would force us as a people to look at who we are and what we're doing to a group of people that we don't like to look at. They're known as condemned violent felons. And most of us turn away from what we are doing in the name of the law regarding that area. And
Yeah.
Can I add just one thing?
Yeah, of course,
quick,
please.
that Buck mentioned earlier, and I think rightfully so. You know, it's easy for people of our generation who remember the Klan in a greater heyday as really terrible, an open terror group of lynchings, bombings, assassinations across the country and especially the South. They are less prevalent with those tactics today, thank heavens. But long before anybody thought of flying planes into buildings and killing thousands of people, in flying planes into the Pentagon, I don't think we should forget that American students bombed the U.S. Capitol in the 1970s and 80s in opposition to the war. We did this. Americans bombed their own Capitol. And we just tend to forget the sordid history of our past that we were a part of when others are involved now.
I think what strikes me is that terrorism and extremism is going to continue, and it's endemic. And despite the fact that a certain person in Washington has said that ISIS has been defeated, that's not what the intel community says, or Farah Pandith.
Well, the president has it wrong. He's measuring success based on physical territory, and that isn't the measuring stick we need to use. In order to understand how to defeat the ideology of the extremists, which is in fact the problem, because if people were not being recruited to the armies of groups like Al-Qaeda or ISIS, we wouldn't have the problem we have today. So we're not looking at this in the right way. President Trump is telling a story based on sort of a visual. Here's what we had, 90%, 92%. He's using all these numbers. It sounds really bold and wonderful. But if you pan out on the globe and you look at where is the ideology that is recruiting young people. We just saw the attacks in Sri Lanka. We know that things are happening around the world, and that's the real threat that we are facing.
Buck, how do we help the American people understand that this is going to be a long, long fight?
I think we have to continue to use the examples as they occur and speak out on them within the context of our court system, obviously. We have to also have public officials that are willing to come out and make statements and argue issues, and within our Congress as well. We have to have the news media understand the nuances of what's involved and be able to come out and expose the situation, whatever it might be. And I think the open acquisition of real knowledge is the most important way we can get behind these organizations and put a stop to, not entirely, but certainly decrease the impact they have on the younger members of society.
You know, but you mentioned the media, of which we're obviously the best part, I have no doubt. But much of it is on both sides. Let's just say they try to make an issue bigger. They try to create, because they're trying to create stuff. And as you said, with the social media, there's so much information out there. What's a person supposed to believe? And what can an individual person do, Rick?
Well, I think anybody has got to stop saying the most dangerous phrase in the English language on this topic, which is, I didn't know. So we have got to educate ourselves. We have to turn towards human rights and understand what they are, that all people have rights, all people are entitled to a life of dignity. We have got to become better familiarized with the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and as voters and people who participate in a democracy, we have to hold our elected officials accountable on human rights issues in this country and beyond, and that is our job. We have to elect officials who protect, advocate, and defend for human rights and stop voting for those who don't.
Rick, Buck, I want to thank you both for being with us. You both are doing an important work. As we've heard, extremism will be a part of our life for a very long time. Think of it as a 30-year mortgage. Also, it's not something that we can just leave to government. All of us have a responsibility to be involved. And here at the McCuistion program, Dennis and I are talking about things that matter with people who care.
For more information, call 214-750-5157 or email nickyn@nickymcquistion.com. Visit our website at www.mcquistiontv.com. You can also follow us on Twitter at www.twitter.com/McQuistionTV or download McQuistion TV video podcast on iTunes.